This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Sahone, and it's Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today we're taking another look at a creature's stat line. Lately, we've taken a look at a lot of impressive aggressive stat lines like 1 mana 2/1s and 2 mana 3/3s, but I thought it would also be interesting to look at stat lines that look pretty bad, and that's what we're going to be doing here today with a look at 3 mana 1/1s. On the face of it, that is just terrible. So for a card to actually see play at the game's highest level of competition, it has to have some pretty impressive stuff in the text box, and indeed, that's going to be the case for most of the cards that made this list. Obviously enough to be eligible for this list, a card had to have a converted mana cost of 3 and both power and toughness equal to 1. In all, 274 cards were eligible for this list, and in this video we'll look at the 10 of those that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A top 8 at a Pro Tour, Players Tour, Mythic Championship, Mythic Invitational, Legacy, or Vintage Championship is worth 2 points, and a top 8 at a Magic Fest or a Grand Prix is worth 1 point. At number 10, it is Mana Gorger Hydra. This 3 mana 1/1 overcomes that terrible stat line by not staying small for very long. The Hydra gains a counter anytime any player casts a spell, so it can grow in a hurry, which is especially nice on a creature that has trample. It first found success in Standard, where it appeared in the very first Hardened Scales decks the game had ever seen. Obviously, the deck ran a bunch of cards that involved counters, and the Hydra grew at an even more impressive rate in this type of deck. The rest of its success has come in Magic's most powerful format, Vintage. Vintage is a format loaded up with cheap and free spells, and that means the Hydra can get huge in a hurry. This is especially true in paradoxical outcome combo decks, which seek to chain a bunch of spells together. Some versions of the deck run a singleton copy of the Hydra as a potential win condition, though the primary way to win the game for those decks does tend to be a card with Storm, but the Hydra gives the deck a way to win without having to rely on that. It is going to gain more points in Vintage going forward and is very likely to move significantly up this list in the future. At number 9, it is Pilgrims Eye. This 3 mana 1/1 comes with both flying and the ability to search up any basic land and put it into your hand. It can be pretty nice to find the mana you need for fixing or to make sure you don't miss a land drop, especially when you add to the board at the same time. While it was originally printed in World Wake, it didn't gain any points as a result of that. It took a reprint in Battle for Zendikar for Pilgrim's Eye to gain some points. It was played in 2 particular decks that could really take advantage of Pilgrim's Eye. One of these was T-Merge, which ran big Eldrazi with the Emerge mechanic like Elder Deepfiend. The Eye was great there because it could allow you to make sure you got important mana, and then after you got that value, you could sacrifice it to an Emerge creature. It was also really good in Delirium decks because it's both an artifact and a creature, so it got you halfway to Delirium all on its own, powering up a significant number of cards in your deck. However, it doesn't have any points since it last rotated out of Standard in 2017. At number 8, it is Goblin Matron, which overcomes its anemic stat line by allowing you to tutor up any Goblin. Over the years, Goblins have been relevant in multiple formats, and if the Matron is legal in that particular format, you can bet she was part of the deck's success. Searching up whatever Goblin is ideal for your situation is amazing, especially because she adds another Goblin body to the board in the process. She's gained points in Legacy, Historic, and Extended Goblin decks, and was perhaps the most important in the Historic version, since that deck was pretty much all in on going crazy with Muxus Goblin Grandee, and she can search him up with no problem. She's also legal in Modern these days thanks to Modern Horizons 2, and while she is seeing some play in Goblin decks there, she doesn't have any points in that format just yet. She does have a reasonable shot at adding to her score in the future though. At number 7, it's another 3 mana 1/1 Goblin, Goblin Sharpshooter. This Goblin can tap to ping something, which is already a pretty solid ability. It might seem like its downside that the Sharpshooter can't untap normally, but the fact that it untaps every single time a creature dies makes it amazing. This means he can kill every X1 on the table all in one turn, and it also means that he combos incredibly well with goblins who have sacrifice effects like Siege Gang Commander or Goblin Sledder. Untapping him really isn't an issue in the Goblin tribal decks that tended to feature him. The Sharpshooter has gained points in Goblin tribal decks in Standard, Extended, and Legacy. Sadly for the Sharpshooter, Goblins haven't been relevant in Legacy for a while. The only way I could see the Sharpshooter maybe getting more points in the future is a reprint. That might sound kind of crazy, but a lot of cards from the old Goblin decks have been reprinted in the last few years, like Goblin Matron, Goblin Piledriver, Skirk Prospector, Goblin Warchief, and Siege Gang Commander, so I could sort of see it happening. At number 6, it is Blade Splicer. This 3-mana 1/1 overcomes that stat line by bringing a friend along, a 3/3 golem that the Splicer also gives first strike to. So in the end, you definitely get your mana's worth with this card stats-wise alone. In Standard, it was mostly played in green-white aggro decks, as well as birthing pod decks, where it was nice to be able to sacrifice the Splicer to the pod and get another creature, while still holding onto the golem. In Modern, it has mostly been played in Hate Bear. It doesn't have any points since 2018, but it has a reasonable chance at getting some more points in the future, especially because it's in Jumpstart Historic Horizons, meaning it now has legality in that arena-only format. At number 5, it is Squea Goblin Nabob. Squea is great because he never stays in your graveyard, since he comes back to your hand every upkeep if you want him to. Unlike the other cards on this list, Squea is very rarely actually cast. This is because it doesn't actually matter how he ends up in your graveyard, you get him back every turn either way. As a result, he has mostly been used in conjunction with discard effects to make their downside pretty much non-existent, and he's been some important fuel for engines in a variety of decks. The card he's been paired with the most consistently over the years is Survival of the Fittest, since you can simply discard Squea every single turn to search up whatever creature you want. It's been played alongside Survival in Extended, Legacy, and Vintage. More recently in Vintage, it's been played in Bazaar aggro decks, which seek to use Bazaar of Baghdad to draw and discard a whole bunch of aggressive creatures who can come back from the graveyard for free, and Squea fits in great because he gives you more fuel to discard to the Bazaar in situations where you don't want to discard some other cards. Bazaar aggro decks have really only emerged recently in Vintage, and they have become pretty dominant, and that's good news for Squea going forward. At number 4, it is Harmonic Sliver. Most slivers need a bunch of other slivers to be worthwhile, but this 3-mana 1/1 lets you disenchant when it enters the battlefield, and that's a pretty nice effect to have on a 3-mana 1/1, or at least it was before the better Reclamation Sage was printed. It's gained points in Extended, Modern, and Legacy, and in all of those formats it was played in decks that could tutor up a singleton copy of the Sliver. In Extended and Legacy this was usually accomplished with Living Wish, and in Modern it was pretty much a staple in Birthing Pod decks since the deck could always tutor it up at an opportune time, like to destroy an opposing Birthing Pod. Birthing Pod decks eventually got banned, and the Harmonic Sliver has been obsolete since the printing of Reclamation Sage, so it's highly unlikely that it ever gains any more points unless a competitive Sliver deck actually materializes, but that probably won't happen anytime soon. At number 3, it is Scion Avuna. This 3-mana 1/1 comes with Flash and Flying, and it's a Fairy Lord. In addition to the boost of +1/+1 to all fairies, it also gives your fairies Shroud, a keyword ability that makes it very difficult for anyone to interact with them. The fact that the Scion comes with Flash is no minor thing either, as playing this at instant speed can effectively counter a removal spell that was targeting one of your fairies, in addition to having a bit of additional upside as a combat trick of sorts. Thanks to all the powerful fairies in Lorwyn, fairies became a very real deck in Block, Standard, Extended, and Modern, and Scion Avuna went along for the ride in a lot of those decks. However, its success, obviously enough, has completely been limited to fairy decks, which haven't been a big deal in Magic in quite some time, and it doesn't have any points since 2012. At number 2, it is Recruiter of the Guard, another 3-mana 1/1 that has an Enter the Battlefield tutor effect. In this case, you get to search up any creature card that has toughness 2 or less, and if you've constructed your deck correctly, that usually means any creature in your deck, which is quite powerful. The Recruiter was printed in Conspiracy Take the Crown, and that means that, when it comes to the Premier formats, it has never had legality anywhere but in Legacy and Vintage. It's also the newest card on this list, meaning it hasn't had the same amount of time to accumulate its score. Despite those limitations, Recruiter of the Guard has done enough to be the number 2 3-mana 1/1 on this list. It has been especially successful in Legacy, where it is almost exclusively played in Death and Taxes. As mentioned earlier, these types of decks tend to run a bunch of toolbox hate creatures, and the Recruiter gives your deck the improved ability to find the one that can really cripple your opponent, since they tend to all have 2 or less toughness. Grabbing that Sanctum Prelate or Phyrexian Revoker whenever you need them is pretty sweet. It also has a single top 8 in the similar Eldrazi white deck. It's going to continue to accumulate points, and it's a pretty good candidate to eventually be the number 1 card on this list. For now though, the number 1 card is orgasmpontiff. When this 3-mana 1/1 comes down, it gives you a choice between pumping your whole board or weakening your opponent's whole board. That's a pretty powerful Into the Battlefield trigger, even on a 3-mana 1/1, especially because the modality it offers means you will likely find a way to get something out of it no matter what. The Pontiff also comes with the Haunt mechanic, which means that when it dies, you exile it and have it haunt another creature. Then, when that creature dies, you get that trigger again. It was pretty good in Ravnica Block Constructed, where Saplings were all over the place and it could wipe them all out. It did very little in Standard, with only a single Pro 2 or top 8, but it's done well in formats with larger card pools. In Extended, he gained a bunch of points in sideboards as he was a great counter to Elf decks. Modern has been orgasmpontiff's most successful format, with most of those points primarily coming in birthing pod decks that I've mentioned several times in this video. He gave you good utility as a singleton card, since you could grab it if you needed to kill opposing small creatures, or if you needed to pump your whole board to swing for lethal. The pod also meant you could sacrifice what was being haunted with it sometimes to get the trigger if that's what you wanted to do. Pod was, as we know, eventually banned, but Orgasmpontiff continues to see play in toolbox decks in Modern. The Pontiff has also found some success in Legacy, finding its way into the sideboards of decks like Eldrazi Aggro and Death and Taxes. The Pontiff gets a pretty big boost from being able to kill true name Nemesis. It's likely to gain more points in the future, but I'm not sure it's going to do enough to outpace Recruiter of the Guard. Well, those are the 10 3-mana 1/1s that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you want to own any of these cards, check out the description where you'll find an individual Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on the almost 400 MTG Top 10s I've already done, including several more on creature stat lines, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.